Hi, everybody. This is Darian on Books, and I want to introduce you to my good friend, Sierra. She writes books and graduated with me at Seton Hill with her MFA, along with many, many, many other degrees and accolades. So we just want to talk about books and what she's writing and all the different cool things that go with that. So, Sierra, do you want to introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit about you?
Sure. So my name's Sierra McNew. I'm originally from, it's mostly the Atlanta area. I work as a pharmacist and I like to write urban fantasy.
Awesome. And so I think what really we want to talk about is what you write and your process. And so, urban fantasy, what is, can you define urban fantasy?
Sure. There's a definition, there's a book out there by Stefan Ekman that's called Urban Fantasy, and it's a really great resource. I think it's a fairly recent book. So I'm going to go with his definition because I think it's really good. And see if I can remember it from the top of my head. But he kind of talks a lot in there about like just how it's very difficult to define. Like a lot of times I will tell people I'm writing urban fantasy, and the first question I get is, "Well, is there rural fantasy?" And people that maybe aren't in the writing world, or maybe aren't big fantasy readers. So I think it's like a little bit hard to define, but kind of usually is like some sort of fantasy set in our world. So yeah, so he defines urban fantasy as kind of often being a hybrid of other genres. So I think if anyone has read urban fantasy, often it's fantasy and something else. So kind of how I kind of, I think, first got into urban fantasies, I got into the Dresden Files in high school and really just like fell in love with that series. And so it's kind of fantasy and detective stories. But I've also seen even some more modern historical fantasy that I would still say has like an urban fantasy vibe, even though it might be historical, but it's set kind of in a world that still feels pretty familiar. If it's, like the past 100 years or so, I'd say it still feels kind of modern in the grand scope of things and still kind of feels like our world. He also says the second quality that he mentions is that it focuses on the unseen. So often, because it's set in our world or something that kind of looks like our world, magic is often hidden from view in some way. So often the characters are having to not let the people who don't know have magic know that they have magic because no one would believe them, or who knows kind of what the various circumstances are in that story. But there are often some reason that the greater world doesn't know that magic exists for the most part. Not always, but I think for the most part it's like that. Though I can think of several examples where people do know. A good example where everyone does know would be like Holly Black's like Book of Night. In that one, I would definitely say that's urban fantasy, but in that one, all of society knows that various magic exists. So I think this can be flexible to some extent. Another way he mentions the unseen element being interpreted is maybe it might focus on like kind of characters in society that are unseen in some way, or maybe not like fitting in quite right to their society. So I think it can also be that kind of element. And then the third element that he mentions is that it kind of shows this interaction between magic and modern society in some way. So I think that's a pretty good definition. It's hard sometimes for me to put a finger on it because it's something that like when I pick it up, it feels very familiar and it feels great. But yeah, I think I've seen a lot of variety.
I love that. I think I'm a big reader of urban fantasy. A lot of fantasy readers are really familiar with it. But yours is really unique. And so before we get into your particular book, I was really interested in your writing process because as we went through, I know for me, as we went through our writing program, my writing process evolved over and over and over until I kind of found kind of a hybrid method between all the different like outlining techniques there are out there, and then how I have to like change my day-to-day schedule in order to get writing in. How do you kind of tackle those things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my approach is also a hybrid in terms of, and people often talk about like pantsers or plotters, and I do think that's probably like a spectrum, but I definitely think I'm somewhere in the middle, which can be frustrating. Like it would be amazing to be able to just plot out everything and just go and be good. I've heard of writers that sit down and outline for weeks, and then they can just go and write it. I'm sure it's still obviously a lot of work, but it's a very methodical process, and I have a hard time often like having the whole outline together before sitting down to write. So I think what I'm finding now as I'm kind of working on a second project is that very early stages of a project to me end up being very pantsing, where maybe there's a character or scene that sounds really fun, and so I kind of just write it and like see where it goes. And that might be, the first even like 20, 30 pages just trying to figure out what would be fun to play around with here. And then often after that, or what I think, again, I'm only on my second big project, but what I think after that then is kind of where I sit back and realize, okay, well, now I'm kind of getting stuck because I don't have a plan beyond here, and then kind of spend a lot more time planning. And then I feel like it's this back and forth of like planning a little bit, kind of writing a little bit, and still kind of pantsing and exploring a little bit, and then coming back and planning a little bit more. And it's a lot of back and forth, which is hard because it feels very slow, because you think you're making all this progress and then you have to stop to plan more, and then you feel like progress is ground to a halt. So I think I'm trying to remind myself that maybe this is just my process, but that's kind of where I've been going so far.
Yeah, it is really hard. I have a different process, and it's probably really slow. And I outline, and then I try to stick to the outline, and I inevitably meander into new ideas and new territories. And like they say, the character starts to talk to me and tell me where it's going. But then as the story progresses, there are scenes, large chunks of the book with my first project that I just had to cut entirely because my idea keeps evolving and changing. And so I'm rewriting. And I think toward the end of my project, I realized that I had cut almost as many words as in my current project that I was using. And so it felt like a really big waste, but also it's not waste, because like that's how you have to use your process, right?
Yeah. And now you have all these scenes that you can save and repurpose for another project.
That's true. And I kept trying to remind myself for that too, is like everything goes into that like swipe file, right? That you can use later, or use for like marketing and like deleted scenes and that. Though I'm like, I have to edit now these deleted scenes to make sure they sound right.
What you're saying too reminds me, I think you were the one that shared this article, an article about like writers having a capacity for zero. Were you the one that shared that article? Maybe not. Okay. One of our writers in our group shared this article that was talking about that you have to be able to have the ability to write and not worry about having to, like you're describing, like scrap it all and start completely over. And I think that that's like such a struggle. I don't know if that, but because sometimes
I don't know. If I shared that sounds like a Sally share, but
maybe.
But yeah, because that's that sunk cost fallacy, right?
Yes.
It's like I've put in all this effort or time or money or whatever, so I have to keep it, even if it's like it would serve you better to just get rid of it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm struggling with that so much, like especially in like early stages of a project where I don't know where it's going. And like right now, I the protagonist for the second project I'm working on is very different from my previous project, and so it's so hard to get a handle on her. And I feel like I need to write maybe just like a bunch of different, almost like vignettes of like her trying to explain herself and figure out which one works. And then the part of me is like, but that's so much wasted time. But I feel like that's going to be the only way to get to where I'm trying to go.
Yeah, I hate writing character interviews or character and things, because I feel like I don't need to know my character's favorite or favorite. Like if it comes up, it comes up later.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But more and more, I'm realizing that I have to do at least a little bit of that to get an idea of who they are, because depending on my mood each day, like the character's personality might be introverted one day, extroverted the next, sad one day, happy the next. I have to figure out what that consistent thing is, and then maybe review it each time before I start writing again to make sure it's not completely different and they sound like a completely different character.
Yeah, I'm so worried about that too. And like I'm worried about, especially on a second project, I'm worried about the voice of the character drifting back to like the voice of the first character who I feel like I resonated with a lot more. So I'm also like really worried about the voice drifting.
Yeah, but I think that's what editing's for, right? Which was another huge lesson I learned. This was like actually the first full novel that I completed, and the editing process is writing is editing, right? Is one of those things floating out there, and it didn't I didn't know how much that was true until I was doing it, and I was like, oh,
Same. Yeah, I feel like editing is very like it definitely like through our MFA program was very intimidating to me. And I was like, I just want to be drafting again. And then I came back to drafting it for the first week or two. I was like, yeah, this is the best. And then now I'm back to like, oh, it's not the best. It's just normal. It's just that they're all hard in different ways. And now I'm kind of like, oh, editing would be so nice right now.
yeah, because that was always where I got stuck, is like I'd get through the first act pretty easy.
Yeah.
I'm like, the idea's there, like the juices and the motivation are there. And then I get like toward the end of the first act and run out of ideas or get stuck somewhere. And then I'm like, well, maybe this wasn't meant to be. But that's where like, I think that's the difference between the writer and the author is, or like, I guess someone who wants to be an author and someone who is an author. And
Yeah.
my definition of author in this case is just someone who has written a book or stories, or that like obstacle you have to push yourself through to get to the next bit and the next bit until you finish.
Yeah. So you have a completed work.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on that, tell us a little bit about your completed work and
Sure.
and the challenges you went through to get there, how that story came up.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my thesis, and I never know like how vague to be since I'm still querying it, so I haven't like it's still like early in that process, but I guess basically the kind of overall when I describe it to non-writers, it's kind of a pharmacist with magic solving a murder mystery. So I think that's kind of one way to look at it. But it's basically the main character has this magic that's forbidden by her society, has kind of walked away from magic for several years. Main character is a pharmacist because I feel like pharmacists don't get a lot of representation in fiction, and when they do, it's often not fantastic. And she kind of confronts this kind of series of murders that are done through magic at her hospital and ends up getting sucked into solving them. So it's fun. It's kind of a fantasy, somewhat amateur detective thriller kind of mix when we go back to that kind of hybrid definition of urban fantasy.
It is super interesting, and you have this amazing talent to turn even like scenes where they're just sitting around a coffee table and talking about, it could be about the cases or it could just be about their own individual conflicts with each other. You have the ability to make it just like page turning, even in the smallest of scenes where there's not a lot of, action going on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
So what were your challenges as you went through? And we had to kind of, I wouldn't say breakneck speed because we had kind of two terms this novel, but we had to meet these monthly deadlines that in a way felt like, okay, I have to hurry. I have to go.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would say definitely now that I'm on a second project, our previous pace feels very fast. But I think that's because like my second project's very underdeveloped. Which I guess this one was too when I came into the program. But I feel like in terms of challenges, I think world building was the biggest challenge for me, especially early on, which is weird because I love fantasy, and that's like almost I read a bunch of stuff, but the vast majority is fantasy, and so I would have thought that that would have been a lot more natural, and it really was not. Like I think some of the other things like dialogue and like what you mentioned, like some of the tension of like, oh, what could happen that would be terrible. Like some of that I think comes a little bit more naturally in the world building. Just I really have to intentionally think about it in a different way. And I think I came in and I, didn't even have like names for the different types of magic. I didn't know how they worked. I didn't know what they felt like, what they looked like. Like I knew very much nothing. And in our MFA program, you get mentors. So you have one mentor at the beginning of the program, and then you get a second mentor kind of partway through the program, and they're all like published authors and fantastic. But my first mentor is Kasoko Jackson. He really like encouraged me. He's like, this is a fantasy novel first. You need to have a lot of fantasy in it. And it really kind of helped to like shift my mindset and start really putting in the work on that side, which I think paid off. But I think that was definitely a challenge.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great segue into kind of topic that you want today, which is like the world building and adding the medical side of things. And because as the lead in this urban fantasy was incredibly fascinating. And I I really like to learn things as I'm reading through, and
Yeah.
learning all the jargon and how things worked and seeing like the process of, I have no idea how working in a hospital as a pharmacist
Oh, yeah.
is. And so it was fascinating on top of the really interesting and intense mystery that was going on. And so, yeah, give us a little, how did you come up with these things other than like, I mean, it's your job, but
Yeah.
layer that in and come up with building?
Yeah, so I think world building, I think because I was struggling with it so much, I think my approach very much has become like trying to find something that I find interesting and then like kind of twisting it to be more magical. My background is in science, so I love like scientific things and weird facts and collecting weird facts about science and like all that I find very interesting. And so I ended up really kind of using that approach as like a springboard for creativity. Um, so that could be everything from like in my thesis, a lot of the magic you kind of see the molecular level, and that feels like cheating a little bit because it's more just like chemistry at that point. Um, but I think I'd also even use this kind of approach for like creating monsters and things like that. So there's like one monster in my thesis that um, is kind of this ethereal, like disembodied thing. And the first time I wrote it was very, like the first time I kind of attempted that scene, the monster was very boring and very, I don't know, very one-sided, felt very much like things that had been done before, and I just like wasn't really happy with it, but I still kind of liked the idea of it, and I was like, how can I make this thing more creepy? And I think even then, and it might be because this project in particular is grounded very much in the medical space, so started thinking about like, well, what are scary things in real life? And things like like there are a lot of like neurological diseases and things like that that are very frightening, and this is like a real thing that can happen in real life and is very frightening. So I kind of got the idea of like, oh, well, it like attacks your neurons, and like kind of then go down like that rabbit hole to make a monster that then now feels very fresh and unique. Where originally it was just kind of this very cardboard cutout kind of monster. So yeah, kind of like that approach. I try to do that for everything. And then now I also try to collect interesting facts. So I have like a file where I collect like names that I think are cool, or story ideas, or cool science facts, or cool history facts, because I think sometimes those can be really interesting if you're trying to like world build like societies or politics and things like that. But now I will kind of throw things in there. And then also, if you meet people that are really skilled in different areas than you, so like my husband is also in like the math sciences, he's in math, so we're around a bunch of mathematicians from time to time, and talking about interesting proofs that are way above my head, but sometimes the concepts are really fascinating. You can like kind of bring the concepts down to like a magic level. Same thing if you're around a scientist, or there are also times when I've encountered we have some friends that are really good at like ancient history and linguistics, and so kind of also picking their brains and kind of figuring out what are cool things about like what they do, and also like are there interesting ways that could be represented in fiction.
I love that. Like I said, it's so fascinating to see all these different things that I had no idea about. The way you even bring them together. So one particular scene comes to mind, but I think you do this several times where I won't give any spoilers. But if I tread on something, say like, no, don't say it.
Okay.
Where you actually like show the inner workings of the body at a molecular level, and how like the monster is attacking the human body, and how the human body's fighting back, and it's just like you're pulling us into this micro world that's also full of magic, and it's so visually visceral and entertaining, and it just sucks you in. And that's one of those things that occurred to me, is like I would never be able to write that because I don't have a background in that. I don't understand that. And it's something I feel like maybe this comes up in your work, and it's like something you can easily visualize because you studied it so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go that deep, or like how did you come up with a scene like that?
Yeah, I think because we did study it like in pharmacy school, there's definitely like classes that's like, okay, now we're talking about all the receptors in the body and all the pathways. And so there's a lot of time spent like memorizing them, and I don't have like all the memorized. Like definitely as I was writing this, I'd go back and be like, okay, do I have, is what I think actually happening? Is this actually the way I'm remembering it properly? But yeah, I think I always really liked organic chemistry and kind of visual and like microbiology, all the small things I really enjoyed in school. So I think it just also is like a personal interest area as well. So.
And you mentioned your husband's work. I think you bring in a little bit of his work into your story too, right?
Yeah,
Can you
he
talk a
created
little bit
very
about
much.
that?
Yeah, I think also, yeah, so I enjoyed math a bit in high school, didn't end up going deep into the theoretical side, but still kind of find what they do very fascinating. But I think I do love when I'm reading and a magic system kind of has a scientific or a math basis. So I'd kind of, and tried to pull that in as well in terms of, in my thesis, like a lot of the magic I kind of then talked about, oh, well, maybe if you were to study it and you were to study the underpinnings of that, what would that look like? And a lot of people interpret that through these kind of more mathematical type equations. So kind of thinking about like how can we present it in a way so that it feels very grounded and it feels very real to the reader? And so again, since I'm like very drawn to like math and science, I kind of like go that way. But it's hard now because now the next project I'm working on, I think the magic is more like poetry based. And so I'm really struggling because I'm so out of my usual science realm, and I feel like I'm struggling with like at what point do I cave and I just add the science back in, or do I keep pushing along and trying to write something that's like a little bit more challenging, because it's not my typical bread and butter. But
That's also an interest area of yours, right? Is
I do like poetry. I do, but I don't feel nearly as skilled at it. So it's definitely, I'm like, where's the science?
poetic science, science in poetry?
Maybe. Yeah, still working on that.
But
Yeah.
and so that brings us right to what you're working on right now. Tell us what you're working on right
Yeah.
now. It's another fascinating thing where I'm
Yeah.
to read your pages.
Yeah. So what I'm working on right now, it kind of grew out of an anthology submissions. Occasionally I try to do like short story submissions for anthologies if there's a topic that sounds fun, and it's a good, I think, exercise to play with a topic, and then also just I'd like to write more short stories and kind of get better at that. Um, so there had been a call for familiar stories recently, and I had submitted for that. I didn't get accepted, which is totally fine. But I kind of had this like beginning of a story of this young character who needs to bond a familiar to kind of become a full member of her like witch society, and she has failed at this a few times before, so she's kind of on the verge of getting kicked out. And she bonds a demon by accident, and at the beginning that's kind of all I had. I think because I gravitate towards murder mysteries, I think there's going to be a murder mystery component in it. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at now. Still very early, trying to figure out what kind of shenanigans will happen. Yeah, it's fun.
So this is interesting. This is less urban fantasy, right? Or more into the paranormal fantasy, or how would you describe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a good sense of like the paranormal fantasy description. I think it's probably a little bit more borderline. Like, I think it's still very much in our world, but it's probably a small town, so it probably feels a little bit. I don't think urban fantasy always has to be in a city, but it often is in a city. So I feel like it feels maybe a little bit more at the edges of the genre in that sense, but still like set in our world. Yeah.
I like that. So is this going to be still in like the YA realm? Would you consider your original work YA or new adult?
Yeah, I think I could see the my thesis being classified as new adult because I think the character's in her 20s, and I think is kind of in that like early adult phase where you're not like super settled yet. She's still fairly new in her job, so I could see it going there. And I think there is still kind of a little bit of this like self-discovery, coming of age, maybe a little bit late for her because she had been so out of her society for so long. But I could see it going there. The new project, originally I wanted the protagonist to be college age, but a lot of the feedback I got early on was that the character should be younger, like high school age. So that's what I'm going with for now, which is also challenging because then I haven't written that age before, and there's just like a lot of dynamics I didn't have to think about with the first project.
Yeah, that is something I think about too, in that I gravitate toward writing my own age, right? And the things that I deal with, which I think like this whole conversation has been about like write what you know. the
Yeah.
atmosphere, and
Yeah.
being able to take everything that you've learned over the years and twist it and make it magical and interesting, more interesting
Yeah.
than it is originally, which is already very fascinating. Um, but yeah, then turning and writing someone who's younger than you that's going to appeal to an audience today sounds very
Yeah.
challenging because the younger generation today is way different than
Yeah.
the same age. So have you started exploring any aspects of that character yet, or you're still very much in those early stages?
I was so early, and I think that's what I'm really struggling with is that like I know kind of the big plot problem in the sense of like, okay, this, she's bonded this demon, obviously this is a problem and be super frowned upon and is going to have all kinds of bad consequences for her. um but I don't have a sense other than her probably feeling a little bit, I kind of gravitate towards characters that feel a little bit like a loner. I think those characters are really always interesting, so I can kind of get the sense that she probably didn't already fit in very well, but I'm still very much digging in terms of like what did life look like before this happened, um like if she didn't fit in very well, why didn't she fit in very well? Was it, just that she'd failed to bond a familiar 2 times before, or did this all start kind of way before that? Because this probably seems like something that would have been going on for years. And so kind of trying to flesh out like the backstory of like how did her personality end up this way and what does she actually care about? That's what I'm struggling with the most is like what did she care about before all this stuff happened other than the obvious of just kind of growing up and fitting in and stuff. So yeah, it's definitely harder than I expected this time around.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think there's an advantage to having it set in like a smaller area where
Mhm.
there's not all the technological influence or like the
Yeah.
influence of what a teenager would be like in
Yeah.
the city. So maybe that like can strip away some of the like technology. You won't have to worry about it. Or even,
Maybe.
like the slang. I worry about slang in my writing all the time.
Oh
Like
my gosh.
what's gonna be relevant 10 years from now and what's not.
Yeah, it's so hard. Yeah, it's a good question of like, how much pop culture do you bring in? Do you kind of set it in a specific time or do you kind of try to leave it more timeless? I think right now I'm going for kind of leaving it more timeless. Um, but yeah, I guess in the editing process, we'll see. Uh, but yeah, I really love, I guess I'm thinking more of TV shows than movies, but I gravitate a lot towards like TV shows in this like age range, or the characters are in this age range. At least I don't know if they're necessarily targeted towards that age range, but you think of like the Sabrina reboot that I really enjoyed, and well, enjoyed except for the end. I didn't particularly enjoy the end, but
You don't have to.
uh, um,
Awful.
yeah, we will have to debrief more on that offline. It just like came out of nowhere. And like Stranger Things, just that one obviously has a very clear time, but I think that one, so much of it is like the 80s nostalgia, and like Teen Wolf and Buffy, like all of those, I feel like very much in that space is kind of that vibe that I'm aiming towards. But
I think Agatha All Along and the
yeah.
scene in Agatha All Along, I think, is very representative of maybe a modern witchy goth teen, without bringing in a lot of that slang and pop culture and everything that feels
Yeah.
timeless as well.
Yeah.
Something like that. You mentioned poetry. So how are you incorporating poetry into it?
That's a good question. I think the spells in this project, I think, are going to be poems, which then I think lends to some sort of interesting things to explore in terms of like, well, who writes them? Do you write your own? Are they co-written? Are there ones that are passed down? Almost like family recipes, and like kind of exploring all those sorts of aspects. And then some of them I'd like to actually be in text. Some of them I'm like roughly writing right now. They're gonna have to be edited later on. I'm like, this is the general idea of what it should say, but it can probably in editing come back and make it feel prettier. But that's kind of where I've been at so far on it.
So these like spells and things?
Yeah, exactly. And then like spells, and then I kind of want, my goal when I started writing this was that I was kind of so burnt out on the science, which now I miss the science. But at the time I was like, oh my gosh, there are so many rules. And because everything in my thesis I tried to make, like, for the most part, fit something that seemed scientifically somewhat plausible. I'm sure there are some things that people are going to be like, that's not plausible, but tried to make them at least sound like they could be. And it just like was really hard to kind of be very constricted like that. And so I was like, this one's going to be a lot more whimsical and like kind of nonsensical and kind of absurd. but then I still feel like I need some sort of underpinning of rule and order. So I'm kind of still trying to find that space. But I kind of like the idea of like using absurd ingredients and I don't just like a little bit that's just kind of like, well, that's ridiculous, but it's very memorable because it's ridiculous, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the magic system, right?
Yeah.
For the magic system. That's super interesting.
Yeah.
I really like that. I am so excited to see more of your pages.
And hopefully it'll get somewhere. It's so early.
So what challenges or I guess differences are you finding in how you worked on your first project versus what you're doing differently now? Or is it kind of are you following the same process?
Yeah, it's interesting how like in some ways I'm reminding myself that I'm following a similar process because in my thesis before we got to school, like I had written like a draft of the first 2 chapters of my thesis like years ago and had kind of poked at it. So there were like some things written that were very early drafts, but didn't really have the plot all figured out. And so this one, I really thought I was going to hit the ground running, do 20 to 30 pages a month and just go. There have been a lot of outside stressors why that hasn't happened, I think partially, but also I think I forgot maybe how much the previous project kind of sat and like marinated. And obviously I don't want this one to sit for years as I'm thinking of, I'm trying to figure out how to speed up that process, but also realizing that there's still going to be some more time for development. So I think I'm kind of following the same process as before, but trying to condense it. And I'm trying to do a lot more of the world building up front. So I think where I'm at in this project, I have a lot more of the world building done for this stage of the project than I did in the last project. And I'm trying to be more thoughtful about designing the antagonist up front. Whereas in my last project, I was like, oh, it's just bad people, we'll figure it out later. And, it's probably 3/4 of the way through the book before I figured that out. And that's probably not the best way to do it. So I'm trying to figure out a lot of that up front, which is making this part feel slow, but I think it will pay off when I get further along in drafting.
I very much worry about like, is it going to be a completely different process every time I start a project?
Yeah.
But I'm comforting myself in the fact of like, no, you just have to get through it, right? And then
just keep going.
You fix it.
Yeah, I think it's so hard because like so much of it is unknown at the beginning, and you don't know like how far you have to go, or like what's around the next corner and how smoothly it's gonna go. But yeah, I think the comfort of like I made some progress because like in other parts of like the original project, there were times when I felt like this is never going to be over, and then a week later I'm like, oh, I'm almost done. And so I think there's like that really weird like mental shift of like you kind of get to the top of the hill and you see like beyond and you're like, oh, this actually wasn't so bad. And then you start telling yourself all the lies about how, oh, this was no work at all. So but yeah, I think just making a little bit of progress.
Yeah, it's like birthing a baby, right? After the first one.
That's what I've heard.
You're like, never again.
That's exactly
more. What I heard. Years later, and you're like, it wasn't that bad, was it? They didn't cry that much.
Yeah, I feel like I've definitely, I think that from everything I've heard, that analogy seems very appropriate.
It's almost just as painful, right? And you talked a little bit about how your monster in your first project very cardboard in the beginning. And that's really where I would get stuck every time I tried to write something before this program was like, this is too much like Hunger Games. I can't write it. I have to scrap it. Or too much like whatever, fill in the blank of my latest favorite thing.
Yeah.
And I realized like it's going to probably feel that way because we have inspiration coming from somewhere. And then the editing process, like you said, like you added in a little bit and you twisted it and you kind of made it your own. Yeah. You just have to get through that process. Is that kind of how you felt as you went through it? Or were you like, were you tempted to scrap it because you're like, oh, it's too cardboard?
That's a good question. Some of both. Like, I think the monster I mentioned before that example, I think I didn't want to scrap because I still really liked that idea. But there was another monster that I did scrap in the book and totally replace it because it just wasn't resonating with me. I think in the current project I do have the temptation to scrap it. Because there's so much I just don't know yet. And so I think even just talking about this with you is encouraging in the sense of like, it just is going to be flat the first time around potentially, or some parts are going to be flat. Like, like a big part of this current project is like that, like how do witches interact with their familiars, and that feels like so flat right now. And I'm like, I know there's a big piece that I'm missing, and I don't know what it is yet. And I think it's like a question of like, do I sit down and do I spend a lot of time doing brainstorm sprints trying to figure that out? Because that's often what I go to try to figure out a world building problem. Or do I just keep going and just hope that it'll figure itself out at some point?
Yeah. And
or leave it.
it seemed like I can't remember really what it was like reading your first few pages because it was 2 years ago, really.
Yeah.
And I never saw like the original ideas, so it might have been like very different when you were first conceiving it years ago. But over the course of reading your pages, it's like the world building got deeper and deeper and deeper to the point there's so many opportunities for you to spin off now based on how you've developed the world. Can you talk a little bit about how that developed? Did it just kind of like spontaneously come about as you figured out the story?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like some of it I think is spontaneous. I think some of it is I really like. I think the areas I think about, like if I like were to kind of go back to that project in that world and like continue on, which I think would be really fun. I think a lot of the areas I'd want to spin off and explore are like kind of related to side characters and their worlds. Still from like the protagonist point of view, because I don't often enjoy as much when stories kind of completely then switch to side character POV, because I'm like, well, I read the first book because I fell in love with the protagonist and now we're in the side character. And but like still enjoying like kind of the side characters worlds. But I think I'm totally rambling, but I think I'm trying to say is I like a lot when the side characters kind of are. I like a level of intrigue or a level of people aren't telling you everything and them kind of having something to hide. And sometimes I know what that is early on, and sometimes I don't know what that is. And I'm like, oh, well, they have something to hide and we'll figure out what it is later. But I think that that's really fun to play with. And something I'm kind of playing with in the new project too, like characters. There's a side character that's completely random that I'm like, oh, this character is really interesting because they're obviously trying to manipulate things and I don't know why, but they're really interesting. So I think some of that just kind of organically, and then as the story goes along, like later on, like something falls into place, or it falls into place in like a different way than what I thought early on. But yeah, I think giving those opportunities and kind of, I think when I was drafting my thesis, I would throw in a lot of things that felt like threads that could be tugged on later. Like I would kind of throw in a little world building thing or a device, because the magic system is very gadgety. Or I would throw in something like, oh, that'd be really fun to see where that goes later. And then if it goes nowhere later, you can come back and cut it out. So I try to it feels a little sloppy when you're drafting, but I try to like throw in some things that I'm like, oh, that could be fun later. And maybe it goes somewhere, maybe it doesn't. But I don't always know where it would go. It's just kind of trying to like spread a wide net.
Yeah, I can't remember where the advice came from. Maybe it was while we were at one of our residencies, one of the author instructors mentioned it, but it was like to place in those little Easter eggs or those threads, and then you can kind of tug at them later, either in this story or the next story. But like as they occur to you, just drop them in and come back to them. And I kind of struggle with that because I love encountering that in stories whenever I'm reading them. But it's do I mention something? Do I like put the Chekhov's gun on the table and then not come back to it in this story? And is that going to be like irritating to the reader? Or do I place it there and then kind of let it marinate? And then when we get back to it, they've completely forgotten about it. And in book 3, it kind of ties things together in this crazy way that I didn't know was going to happen, but figure it out along the way.
Oh, so yeah, I think across books is even another level of challenge of like how much to put in there. Because I think within one book, it's easy for me, or not easy, but like I comfort myself that I'm like, oh, I can always scrap it. But but I think it's definitely like a higher challenge doing it across books, because then depending on how much you know about like what's happening later, like whether you come back to it or not. I think if it's not distracting, I think it's fine to throw in. And like maybe you come back to it, maybe you don't. Maybe it's just a cool little world building thing to make the world feel real.
Yeah. And I've kind of like comforted myself too with the idea that like if you don't come back to it and people start reading your book and they notice it and they mention it, it's almost like that. It's that conversation piece that can get people talking.
Yeah, it's like all the speculation.
Yes.
So I think you should throw it in then.
It's like even like recording videos, I'm like, oh, I hope I got the fact right, or there's going to be controversy around this particular opinion or whatever, and I used to really worry about that. And now I'm just like, it'll spark a conversation maybe, and that's good for me. So
That's awesome. I think that's a good way to approach it. Yeah, because I also like, yeah, just like I think the fear in writing, it's like a very weird profession in the sense that it's like so public facing, and yeah, it's like it's a weird vibe to get used to.
yeah, you're essentially bearing your soul on the page and
Yeah,
people and being like, here, I hope you like what my soul looks like.
yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, and
Definitely feel that.
It was one of our critique partners that pointed out all the different mother themes I had in my book, and I
Yeah.
at all. And looking back, I was like, oh, it's very telling.
Oh, yeah, no, it's weird how like yeah, themes I feel like don't come out until so much later, and it's weird because yeah, especially like in this like a new project early on, I'm like, oh, I want to know the theme, and but like it's really hard to know what it will be.
Yeah, I can't. I know some people will start with like, I want to write about, this particular theme, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And they kind of build a story around that. I just can't. I don't know how they do that. I don't know. I can't do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. I think it's very hard. I feel like in this next time around, I have a little bit of an idea of like trying to balance like the protagonist and the antagonist a little bit in terms of like them maybe both facing similar challenges and responding to them differently, which I think could play into a theme, but I don't have a good sense yet of like how to like hammer that theme home in like pivotal scenes, which is what I really want to do. And maybe that's an editing thing, but like I really like when whatever either the theme or the protagonist's main struggle, I really like when that is just like really hammered home with like the larger more kind of pivotal or pinch point scenes where they're really like facing that. I really like that, but it's a little hard to do.
I think that's another one of those Easter egg things, right? Or those threads where you're like adding things back in after the editing in a certain way so that symbolism stands out or that theme like hits home at the end. Definitely not a first draft thing for me anyway.
No. Yeah, no, I don't think so at all. Yeah, because I think I like even in like my thesis, like I think so much of it kind of as I was writing into it kind of revolves around like the protagonist like fear of basically like, hurting someone with her magic. And I think I didn't like set out to like write a book about that. And so like some of the action scenes, like the first draft of them, I was just like, oh, this would be a really fun action scene. And then the second draft, it's a little bit more like, oh, but how is this action scene really terrifying, like through that lens of somebody who feels that way?
I did want to ask you if you had like a big piece of advice or one piece of advice to give people who are trying to write their first novel or kind of stuck in a story that they're working.
Yeah, I'd say, and this might be kind of like, I don't know, it's maybe a little bit of a two-part. I think the first one, kind of like what we talked about, maybe just like not giving up, like the sense that like, even when you don't have everything figured out, that's completely normal, and to just give it a try anyway. And I think the second piece of advice I would say is also, when you are stuck like that, I think I mentioned like thing that kind of really helped for me, like breaking out of some of those world building challenges was like brainstorming sprints. I know we talk a lot about writing sprints, and like where you kind of set a timer and you write and you just write for that amount of time and you try not to think about it and you just go. And I think I kind of have to do the same for brainstorming to get brainstorming to work for me, because otherwise I just kind of sit there and I'm like, okay, how do I brainstorm it? And I think if there's not that pressure of like the time ticking down, I like won't actually start. And maybe I don't enjoy brainstorming as much. I don't know what it is, but that was like such a game changer for me. Is just like saying, and I think also then like not feeling like I'm stuck or like spending time. I think just that sense of saying like I'm taking 15 minutes and I'm only working on this one problem, this one question that I can't answer. That was really game changing for me.
I like that. I think people don't think about it as much. You think about sprints as in writing sprints. Okay, I have to for the next few minutes. But I love that idea of being able to brainstorm one particular topic, even for a few minutes, because I will often like feel like I have to set a whole bunch of time aside in order to work on my project. When you're right, it could just be like 15 minutes, one question or one thing I'm trying to think of.
That is on my agenda for today with the things I mentioned that I'm like, I just don't know what this character cares about.
Can you tell what you're brainstorming then?
Yeah, so I think one of them, I'll probably do a few 15-minute sprints. One of them is going to be like, what does this character even care about like in their normal life? I have like I also get really interested in bargains between characters, and that's kind of a theme I kind of come back to. And I think some of the other characters that are helping her trying to figure out, well, then what do they want, or like what do they offer? Because I think what they offer, probably my initial thought was kind of the real thought, but obviously if they're being sneaky and tricky, that's probably not what they offer. So trying to figure out like what would they offer that like is not what they ultimately want, or like that kind of cloaks it somehow. I think those are two of the big things I really wanted to brainstorm today.
I like that. That's very cool. So thank you, Sierra. This was
Thanks for having me.
Where can people find you if they want to?
Oh man, I feel so official. That's so nice. I do have a website. You can get to it either sierramcnew.com or sierramcnewwrites.com, and a writer Instagram at Sierra McNew Writes, or sierra.mcnew.writes, I think.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes. And on there, are you going to tell us about your writing process and your progress as you get?
Oh, yeah. On my website, I've been the website's kind of new to me, so I'm kind of trying to figure out like what fits my vibe, I guess. But yeah, I'm kind of doing some like blog type posts from time to time about writing thoughts and updates and such. So yeah.
Awesome. And I'd love to have another conversation with you as you kind of figure those things out in terms of like marketing and how focusing your like author brand and stuff as you figure that out.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sierra, and we will see you in the next video very soon. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Bye.